Thank you very much. And here I was worrying about Kate fatigue. So thank you. So thank you, Tim. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Alex for having me over all these years. And I don't want to take up too much time because I want to get to our speaker. So Dirk Moses is the Anne and Bernard Spitzer Professor of International Relations at the City College of New York, CUNY, where he has been since 2022. Educated in Australia, Scotland, and the US, he taught at the University of Sydney for many years, also holding professorships at the European University Institute in Florence and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, that's my state, before assuming his post at City College. Dirk has written extensively in the fields of genocide and memory studies, as well as intellectual history. Recent co-edited volumes include The Holocaust Museum and Human Rights, Transnational Perspectives on Contemporary Memorials, that's 2025. The Russian Invasion of Ukraine, Victims, Perpetrators, Justice, and the Question of Genocide, that's 2024. And Patriotic History and the Renationalization of Memory, 2023. Dirk's latest book, which is getting a lot of traction, several of us in this room have been teaching portions of it, is The Problems of Genocide, Permanent Security, and the Language of Transgression, which was published in February 2021. So for those of you online, for those of you here in the room, please join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Dirk Moses.
Many thanks, Kate, for the generous introduction. Tim and Alex for the invitation to be here. It's a great honor also to close out proceedings with a full-length paper, 45, 50 minutes or so. Now, as mentioned, I edit the Journal of Genocide Research. I don't know if you did mention that, but I'm mentioning it now. And I just wanted to say we're running a few forums. One we did on Ukraine recently, the end of 23. It came out as a full issue of the journal, double issue actually. And we're currently running several on Gaza, and also this one on, it's called Artsakh Nagorno-Karabakh, Famine, Memory and Security, the Question of Genocide. The forum title is in a tiny font above the title. Here are just two articles that we've published in the forum, one by Elisa Midgian, who's the professor at Clark University, and a lot of you know her more amazing work, in Simon Makdinian, who's in Denver. And more are coming. If any of you are experts in that area, do consider sending us an article for that forum. Now, as an Australian, I've long been interested in the decimation or genocide of Indigenous peoples in Australia, and why until recently it was not regarded as shocking to most settler Australians. By contrast, they were shocked by the Holocaust, although very few of them have a biographical relationship to the Holocaust, while all settler Australians do have a relationship to the genocide in Australia. As I discovered 20 years ago in editing this book, considerable resistance exists in deploying the concept of genocide in such settler colonial cases. Repeatedly, I encountered Australians who denied genocide occurred in Australia because no Holocaust-like event or series of events could be discerned. The Holocaust, they said, was a genocide, not what occurred in Australia. Only few agreed with the activist who sprayed "No Pride in Genocide" towards the bottom of the plinth there on this colonial monument in Sydney that you see on the slide. Most settler Australians could see no shocking evil in the country's settlement. The greatest evil in world history, they said, had taken place in Europe, so far away from Australia, in the 1930s and 40s. I became fascinated by the work performed by Holocaust memory, firstly by sensitizing people to human rights abuses. And I think that's the theme or spirit of this conference. The iconic story of Anna Frank is emblematic in revealing the manifest evil of National Socialism and inspiring people to ensure that such evil does not recur. But secondly, also how Germany's monumental crime, committing what some call the absolute genocide, effectively relativized others or even disqualified them as genocide. That's what I saw in Australia. When asked about the Herero genocide in German Southwest Africa before First World War, a famous German historian called Götz Arley, who Steve will know as well, anyone here who does German history, said it was really a colonial reprisal Gegenwehr is the German word, a form of self-defense or response, a defensive response, because he said the Africans had started it with their uprising. He never asked, of course, whether the exploitative and violent occupation of their territory was itself a provocation. Now, these arguments continue in the genocide debate about Gaza, in which one side sees a genocide and the other side a legitimate war of self-defense. Proponents of the latter, of the self-defense argument, go further, arguing that the genocide claim is indeed an anti-Semitic attack, a blood libel. A petition signed by prominent rabbis and some academics was called, in fact, Stop the Blood Libel. I'm not going to read out the whole extract. This is just extracts of the preliminary text, but it says, "We, the undersigned, are outraged and sickened by the latest blood libel to be inflicted on the Jewish people. The lie that Israel committed genocide in Gaza. We reject this accusation with contempt." The text actually is still on this page. The key issue is down the bottom, where it says, "The classic definition of genocide has been changed to apply only to the Gaza war, just as anti-Israel NGOs changed the definition of apartheid and colonialism only to apply to Israel." And if you move to the top, it says, second paragraph, "A crucial difference," and this is the key of my paper, this distinction, "the crucial difference between war as tragedy and war as genocide is intent. In this war, only one side has committed genocide, and that is Hamas." And that is a further quotation from the Stop the Blood Libel petition. The central paragraph, I think, is important to understand the vehemence and the intensity of the feeling about this. "The accusation of genocide," they say, "has become a pretext for excluding, attacking, and even murdering Jews around the world." Of course, I come from Sydney, and we recall the terrible Bondi massacre not so long ago. "Its purpose is to delegitimize Jewish self-determination and turn the only Jewish state into the world's archenemy and pariah." Now, on this reading, it is Israel that is confronted by an implacable genocidal enemy, yet the genocidal accusation is now used unfairly, according to this argument, to incite violence against Jews around the world. Tony Blair effectively made the same argument in a recent opinion piece, as you can see there. And so did these figures. These are three separate slides. One is an article by John Spitzer, a military counterinsurgency character. He says, "I'm a war scholar. There is no genocide in Gaza." It's a meme, one of many that I see on social media. The genocide is what Hamas did. The rest is war. Once again, that war-genocide distinction. And I think a very interesting series of statements by Matthew Feinberg. I don't know him personally, but I saw this on X, where he says, and I think this is the usual genocide versus war distinctions, but I think in addition, this is an interesting statement. "You don't get to hijack a term created to prevent Jewish annihilation and use it against Jewish survival." So what he's effectively arguing is that the thought of Israel committing genocide is in fact inconceivable for him, because the purpose of the Genocide Convention is to protect Israel in particular and Jews in general, but seemingly no one else, according to that statement. I'm just sharing this for you to understand the lay of the discursive land. Now, it's hard to overstate the hegemonic status of this war versus genocide distinction. Consider the perspectives of the US politician Chuck Schumer and the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert from last year. Here's Chuck Schumer in an interview in the New York Times. "Genocide is described as a country or some group trying to wipe out a whole race of people, a whole nationality of people. So if Israel was not provoked," this is very much like Gertz Ali in the Gegenwehr argument, "and just invaded Gaza and shot at random Palestinians, Gazans, that would be genocide. That's not what happened. In fact, the opposite happened. It's Hamas that is much closer to genocide than Israel." Now, Schumer here distinguishes between genocide, which he models effectively on the Holocaust, and Israel's legitimate self-defense against a genocidal attack by Hamas. Now, if one follows this line of argumentation, it's understandable and maybe even legal for Israel to kill 70 times more Palestinians than Israelis died on the 7th of October, and to then utterly destroy Gaza. Yet it's Palestinians who committed the crime of crimes, genocide. Indeed, he goes further, anticipating Tony Blair, in saying that it's anti-Semitic to claim that Israel is committing genocide. Consider now as well Ehud Olmert. This is an article from clipped from Haaretz in May last year. This is, you can see there he is at the bottom, okay, where he says, over the past year, harsh accusations were voiced worldwide against the Israeli government and its military conduct in Gaza, including accusations of genocide or war crimes. In public debates in Israel and on the international arena, I've rejected such accusations firmly, though I didn't shrink from criticizing the government. The great number of innocents killed in Gaza down the bottom was hard to fathom, unjustified, unacceptable, but all, as I've said on every media outlet, resulted from a vicious war. Once again, it's war, not war crimes or genocide. Then he says, in recent weeks, there's a change of heart. In recent weeks, I've no longer been able to do so. What we are doing in Gaza is now a war of devastation. I want you to remember that turn of phrase, a war of devastation, indiscriminate, limitless, cruel, and criminal killing of civilians. We're not doing this due to a loss of control in some specific sector, not due to some disproportionate outburst by some soldiers in some unit. Rather, it's a result of government policy, knowingly, evilly, maliciously, irresponsibly dictated. Yes, he says, Israel is committing war crimes, so not genocide, right? After all that, it's quote unquote just war crimes. Although he talks about a war of devastation after long deflecting criticisms of Israeli military conduct. So yet, despite recognizing the manifest criminality of the war, I mean, he talks about evil and so forth, he lands on the notion of war crimes and not genocide. Now, let's compare these views with what Raphael Lemkin, there he is, said when he theorized for the first time about genocide in this book, Axis, Rule, and Occupied Europe, was written in late 1943, published then, it came out a year later for various reasons. So sorry about all these quotes, but we need to go back to the source so you really believe me. Like, so he's not making this up, right? This is Lemkin now, I think this is page 80, where he says, genocide is the antithesis of the Rousseau-Portalis doctrine, which may be regarded, as implicit in the Hague regulations. Once again, I remember the term Hague regulations. We're talking about the laws and customs of war or international humanitarian law. This doctrine holds that war is directed against sovereigns and armies, not against subjects and civilians. In its modern application in civilized society, the doctrine means that war is conducted against states and armed forces and not against population. It required a long period of evolution in civilized society to mark the way from wars of extermination. Sounds like wars of devastation, right? Wars of, like Olmert mentioned, wars of extermination, which occurred in ancient times and in the Middle Ages, to the conception of wars as being essentially limited to activities against armies and states. So this is classic International Committee of the Red Cross language, okay? The principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. In the present war, so in World War II, however, genocide is widely practiced by the German occupant. Germany could not accept the Rousseau-Portalis doctrine, first because Germany is waging a total war, and secondly because, according to the doctrine of National Socialism, the nation, not the state, is the predominant factor. In this German conception, the nation provides the biological element of the state. Consequently, in enforcing the new order, the Germans prepared, waged, and continued a war not merely against states and their armies, but against peoples. And that makes it a war of extermination, right? For the German occupying authorities, war thus appears to offer the most appropriate occasion for carrying out their policy of genocide. I won't read the rest of it, but you don't have time. Sorry, I was quoting the top 4 lines there. Okay, now this comparison between Schumer and Olmert, on the one hand, who say war and genocide are completely separate domains, and Lemkin, who is saying that genocide is a modality of war, a type of warfare, reveals, I think, what I call in this book mentioned by Kate, the problems of genocide. And that's why I decided to call it that, because the concept of genocide, as it's been codified in law, is highly problematic. The problems are many, but let's remind ourselves what Schumer and Olmert are saying, namely that although Lemkin was originally trying to outlaw wars of extermination, or wars of devastation, as Olmert calls it, when he coined the word genocide in sort of 1942-43, such wars have been separated from genocide as a legal category and limited to what Schumer effectively calls premeditated attacks on a group simply for being that group, not in circumstances of armed conflict. Only this very specific intent to destroy is criminalized in the UN Genocide Convention, not the results of a war of annihilation that everyone can see in Gaza, even Ulmer. So we have this perplexing situation where the public, I think much of the global public, can see destruction, which of course is the operative word in the Genocide Convention, which is of course about the intent to destroy, while the law needs to discern that criminal intention to destroy regardless of results. Now, it may or may not do that is decide that it's genocide, when the International Court of Justice gets around to hearing the case in a few years. And of course, by then it's far too late for Palestinians. Thus, my question is, how and why did the law end up distinguishing genocide and wars of annihilation, or if you like, genocidal warfare? How did it distinguish between genocide and genocidal warfare? Genocide is criminalized by the UN Convention, but not genocidal warfare. So I'm going to have a section now called military objectives or military necessity in the post-war order. Now, this distinction was effected in the rehabilitation of military objectives and military necessity by the victors of World War II after its discrediting or their discrediting by the Nazi mode of warfare. Lumpkin's broad definition of genocide was dangerous, which he himself came to see, because it could capture modern warfare, which was necessarily total, in view of aerial bombing, including, of course, the 2 atomic weapons dropped on Japanese cities. Let's remind ourselves of how broad Lemkin's wartime definition of genocide was. Remember, he wanted to augment the Hague Conventions on the laws and customs of war. In other words, he wanted to make genocide a species of the laws of war in the following way. So this is a quotation from page 93 of his book, where he says, the preamble is, we should amend the Hague regulations in the following way. In the first instance, should be included every action infringing on the life, liberty, health, corporal integrity, economic existence, and the honor of the inhabitants when committed because they belong to a national, religious, or racial group. And in the second, every policy aiming at the destruction or aggrandizement, not and or the aggrandizement of one group to the prejudice or detriment of another. I mean, this is what a definition of colonial occupation is. Okay. To that end, he proposed these techniques of genocide, as he called them. And you can see there are 7. And what he did in doing so, he tried to join particularly in the Polish experience, the exterminatory policies against Jews, which he was well aware of as a Jewish Pole, as well as the other kinds of policies which were applied to the majority Christian Polish nation, so that Christians and Jews could be joined in one generic concept of genocide, and thereby you would encourage outside Europe, in the US and among the Allies, a recognition that the Jewish and Christian faiths were united. And the reason he felt he had to do that is because what we now call the Holocaust, not a term people used during the war, the persecution and mass murder of the Jews was not a priority for the Allies. They were sort of largely aware of it by 1943 in its fuller extent. But if anyone knows that Deborah Lipstadt's first book is a study, it's totally forgotten now, she's famous for her trials and so forth, but her first book is a study of the American press during World War II. And she points out that, the Nazi persecution and mass murder of Jews was reported, but it's like one column on page 10 of the New York Times. This is not front page news. And when you read the speeches of Roosevelt, which I did for this book, you realize because he's trying to convince the American public to join the war. They understood the Nazi regime as a pagan, anti-Christian, above all, anti-Christian project, which was occupying the Christian nations of Europe, which had small Jewish minorities, but these are Christian nations, and destroying them. So we needed to confront this anti-Christian movement. Now, of course, that's not how we understand the Nazis today, but that's how they did at the time. And Lemkin, of course, is watching this and says, the Nazi project is really anti-Semitic and they're to exterminate the Jews. So I'm going to come up with a concept which is so broad, as you saw from these definitions, which captures what happens to Christian Poles, for example, and Jews. And so a technique of genocide means withdrawal of self-government. Cultural genocide means what you think it means, right? Economic genocide means advantaging the settler Germans over the native Poles. Biological genocide is differential in food supply. Physical genocide is, biological genocide is about, say, preventing births between groups. For example, he would go so far as to argue that if you separate the men and the women in work details, and make sure they can never meet, they live in separate barracks, then ergo they can never procreate, and the nation will eventually become extinct. So that's, as he called, a biological technique of genocide. Moral technique of genocide, he included the inculcation of alcoholism and pornography among the population, sort of to reduce their lofty national spirit. Anyway, it's an extraordinarily broad definition of genocide. So what is noteworthy as well is that he also proposed this as a development of the laws of armed conflict, or the laws of war, or laws and customs of war, as it was called. So genocide here, for him, was conceived as a mode of occupation, a military occupation, which destroyed or crippled nations under occupation. Now, of course, this was the deeply subversive idea to the architects of the post-war order, the victorious allies, who did not want to criminalize really any mode of warfare, including the dropping of atomic bombs. They therefore made a basic distinction between war or armed conflict on the one hand and genocide on the other. War or armed conflict was motivated, they said, by the legal and legitimate imperative to defeat an enemy when the killing is supposed to stop, while the latter, genocide, was driven by the criminal and thus always illegitimate intention to destroy an enemy people as an end in itself. Armed conflict warfare, according, is not illegal according to the UN Charter if carried out in self-defense, a just war. Now, until the UN Charter, as many of you know, there were fewer limitations to state conduct when it felt that its existence is imperiled. Self-preservation has been the basic prerogative of states since time immemorial. Now, though, international law insists that just wars are fought justly, meaning that principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality are observed. If civilians are killed disproportionately in military targeting of military objectives, war crimes may be committed. If attacks on a civilian population are widespread or systematic, we're talking about crimes against humanity, but not genocide. That is reserved for the intention to destroy an ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part as such, which in my view is a mythical intention that never occurs in reality, because states, and even the Nazi one, attempted in their self-understanding to destroy groups as parts of military and security campaigns. Yes, even the Einsatzgruppen understood that as a security threat. The idea was to murder potential security threats. And this is how the Draft Convention of Genocide, the commentary on the Draft Convention of Commentary, passed the matter. That's the Draft Convention on the Crime of Genocide. As you know, there were two drafts before the final version, and the commentary on this is really fascinating because it makes that distinction, and we can get to the first time that's made in law. So you can see the date is June 1947. Let's examine the reasoning. The act must be deliberate. This means that the object must be destruction of a group of human beings. Now, the next sentence is chilling. By this definition, certain acts which may result in the total or partial destruction of a group of human beings are in principle excluded from the notion of genocide, namely international or civil war, isolated acts of violence not aimed at destruction of a group of human beings, the policy of compulsory assimilation of a national element, mass displacements of populations. 2, the infliction of losses, even heavy losses, on the civilian population in the course of the operations of war does not, as a rule, constitute genocide. In modern war, belligerents normally destroy factories, means of communication, public buildings, etc., and the civilian population inevitably suffers more or less severe losses. It would, of course, be desirable to limit such losses. Various measures might be taken to achieve this end, but this question belongs to the field of the regulation of the conditions of war and not that of genocide. So you can immediately see that the defenders of Israeli and indeed Russian conduct today would seize on these statements as supportive of their position. However, the next point in the document does leave the door open for an alternative. Point 3, war, however, may be accompanied by the crime, accompanied is the word, by the crime. So it is something separate still, but it's accompanied by the crime of genocide. This happens when one of the belligerents aims at exterminating the population of the enemy territory and systematically destroys, and this is key, what are not genuine military objectives. So they separate that again. Examples of this are the execution of war prisoners, which of course covers Srebrenica, as we heard this morning, the massacre of the population of occupied territories, and their gradual extermination. These are clearly cases of genocide, according to the commentary. So the debate would turn on the facts. Were there massacres of the occupied population and their gradual extermination? So that's not a matter of law, but a matter of fact. Can you prove that? And yet, even on this reasoning, genocidal losses, if you want to call it that, can be occasioned by armed conflict and not be genocide. Because if you go back to the first point, it says, by this definition, certain acts which may result in the total destruction of a group of human beings. It's not genocide if it's happening in the course of an armed conflict. Do you find that extraordinary? I do. I think that, what were they thinking? Well, they were thinking, we in the West in particular, at that time, have the monopoly on atomic weapons, though the Russians hadn't started on that yet. And we want to make sure that that is not covered by the Genocide Convention. And the British and the Americans also kept it out of the Geneva Conventions in the next year, in 1949. Okay. The problem of this distinction was immediately identified by the Dutch delegation at the United Nations, which commented on this provision, which we've just been commenting on, of the draft convention by introducing the brilliant notion of camouflaged genocide. So this is a document in which they made this. You can see it's April 1948. The topic is the convention. And here you have a communication that the Secretary General has received from the Netherlands. Okay. Now, what do they say? They say, an important element in the definition is that the crime must have been perpetrated with the purpose of destroying a specific group of persons, and we have no objection to that, okay, say the Dutch. But then you see where they quibble. It will have to be established beyond doubt, however, that so-called camouflaged genocide will be equally punishable. This covers cases in which the defendant, who's being accused of genocide, might plead that the incriminated action, although it did in fact lead to the destruction or frustration of a group, was not aimed at that group. Okay, so they understand that all it takes for a perpetrator to get away with genocide is that our intention was a military intention. And unfortunately, we exterminated the entire group. But it's not genocide, it's something else. So the Dutch understand, no, this is a real problem. And so their solution is to invent this concept of camouflage genocide. Unfortunately, the last sentence is somewhat convoluted. Okay, but let's try to nut it out. Only the coincidence, the defendant might contend, that the group contained many who infringed certain legal provisions not aimed at them, against them, led to the unintended result that the group was destroyed or hampered in its existence or development. Now, to remedy this obvious loophole, the Dutch suggested amending the convention by adding what we might call a reasonability clause, possibly reflecting their own experience of having been occupied by the Germans just a few years before. So this is their clause. To this end, it might be useful to add at the end of Article 1 the following. Such action will be equally considered to have been aimed against one of the groups mentioned if the action, although alleged to have a different purpose, like a military purpose, has in fact unreasonably hit that group. Brilliant idea. The word unreasonably, though, as at the same time, so they give and they take back. You see, that means they did allow for what they call reasonable hits on a group. The word unreasonably should be understood as in disproportion to what the group or its members deserve. This limitation of the effect of the incriminated action prevents that a group of bandits should shield themselves with a political national name in order to be able to present themselves as victims of genocide. What they're arguing about is a terrorist group embedding themselves in a population and then saying, you can't attack us because you're going to then damage others, the civilians, and that's genocide. They wanted to prevent that. Now, this stipulation likely reflected their own experience, on the other hand, with counterinsurgency in the East Indies, Indonesia, at the time when Dutch forces were battling Indonesian ones fighting for national independence. The historians among you will know that there were 2 Dutch police actions in the late 1940s in order to regain control of their former empire, which had been taken off them by the Japanese during the Second World War. And then as the Japanese were defeated and withdrew, nationalist groups entered. There were Muslim, communist and nationalist, Sukarno nationalist groups who actually fought with each other and against the Dutch to gain national independence. And the Dutch sent troops there to confront them and committed countless massacres. And so I think the stipulation of the unreasonable and the stipulation, the notion of a group of bandits reflects that experience, which was happening in real time. So as they were negotiating at the United Nations, they were also in the Dutch East Indies. Now, the main point here is that the problems of genocide were identified in 1948 and that the Dutch attempt to prevent camouflage genocide failed. Their proposed amendment was unsuccessful. And as a consequence, camouflage genocide has marked the post-war order ever since. And, you know, we're still arguing about, is what happened in Ukraine genocide, is what happened in Gaza genocide, and, you know, what happened to the Tamils in 2009, was that genocide? And for this reason, I argue that the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, passed by the UN General Assembly in late 1948, did not mark some momentous humanitarian step forward in outlawing the wars, wars of annihilation, as commonly supposed. And I think in this respect, I differ fundamentally with the premise of Genocide Awareness Week, and probably many of the speakers here. For the states that thrashed out the convention designed it so that state sovereignty would not be compromised in pursuing their security interests. In other words, so they could continue to wage wars of annihilation if they felt they needed to. How? Well, the answer, I repeat, is that the convention criminalized only a very narrow and virtually impossible to prove modality of mass violence, which doesn't really happen in reality anyway, destroying a group solely on the grounds of racial antipathy based on what we could call, if you like, a Holocaust archetype. And they elevated it then to the crime of crimes, meaning that other modes of state violence were sort of not so bad, not so shocking. Now, these states, after all, did not regard warfare as illegitimate. They weren't pacifists. Note the tension between the Pope and the President of the US on this matter right now. They had just defeated the Axis powers, destroyed their cities with fire and atomic bombs, and countenanced the forced expulsion of 12 million ethnic Germans from East Central Europe. The Cold War was beginning, and independence movements confronted Western colonial empires reasserting control in Asia and in Northern Africa. Think of the French in Algeria, where they committed massacres against Algerians in 1946-47, killed tens of thousands of people. For the war's victors, the sovereign right of states to engage in international and non-international armed conflict required the rescue of military necessity from its discrediting by the Nazi mode of exterminatory warfare and occupation. The distinction between war and genocide, between the intention to defeat and the intention to destroy, allowed for the theorization of genocidal warfare as legitimate. That was the argument of the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, Robert Jackson, who, when he wrote an article for the New York Times Magazine, here it is, from microfiche, so it's a bit messy, to explain the impending Nuremberg proceedings to the US public. In an article called The Worst Crime of All, he justified why aggressive wars, which we just heard from the previous speaker, were the Nuremberg Charter's supreme crime, because all others, crimes against humanity and war crimes, derived from the German invasion. Appearing a month after the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities, the article drew a further terrible, these are the Nazi war criminals, of course, a further terrible conclusion. You all know who Robert Jackson was, don't you? He features, of course, in the new Nuremberg film. But to consider his status, like he is the great humanistic figure of the Nuremberg trials, along with the British prosecutor. But Jackson makes the opening speech, which goes for hours, I think, and it's very humanistic. And he's seen, therefore, in posterity as marking a high point of, if you like, humanitarian thinking and thinking in terms of international justice in the middle of the 20th century. Now, appearing a month after these two atomic bombs, he drew a further terrible conclusion. These are quotes from the article. "If there are to be future wars, we have got to win them," he declared, "by being better killers," down here on the left, "by killing more and by killing more quickly than the enemy, by killing with less risk to ourselves." This could be the current Secretary of Defense speaking. In elaborating this argument, Jackson advocated violating the legally established principle of a distinction between combatants and non-combatants, the Rousseau-Portalis doctrine that Lemkin was mentioning, right? By casting warfare as a conflict between peoples rather than military forces. Point two, for the fact is obvious that modern warfare has become more and more a struggle between whole populations, not among armies alone. The issue is which shall be subjugated and which will survive. Consequently, it was necessary in future wars, number three now, to kill and maim the enemy and destroy all that shelters him and all that he lives by, not only in the field, but at home. In other words, the bombers go in and flatten the cities. Killing the enemy's civilians until they surrendered was the strategy, as the unmentioned cases of Hiroshima and Nagasaki indicated. Now, the last quote, number 4, is taken from his testimony or his statements at the Nuremberg trials, where he says, "The Nazis, by contrast, had murdered civilians for no military purpose." Okay, so we may subjugate entire populations to make sure that they're subjugated so we survive, but that's not genocide because it's an armed conflict, although it involves effectively genocidal warfare because it's between entire peoples, a war of extermination, as Lemkin put it. Remember, that's what a war of extermination is. The entire population is the object of attack, not just the military. So I think, as you can tell, that this distinction is entirely specious. Now, this, of course, is the reasoning of Schumer and Oldman we saw a few minutes ago. Hamas killed for no military reason, solely because of anti-Semitic hatred, whereas Israel is operating on a logic of military defeat, not genocide. The fact that Israel has killed probably far more than 70 times more Palestinians than Hamas killed on the 7th of October, quite apart from laying waste of Gaza and effectively annexing more than half of it, is irrelevant to this argument. What matters is not the result, but the quality of the intention. Now, strange as it may seem to you, this is the law. And that is why, in my view, the legal approach to genocide falls behind the reality we see unfolding before our eyes. And as a consequence, wars waged ever since Nuremberg and the Genocide Convention, in which millions of civilians have died, cannot be legally categorized as genocide. So what I want to show in the rest of this lecture is how this distinction is played out. I'll do this very cursorily. In the last 50 years, first in the debate about the Vietnam War, which is almost exactly like the debate today, before turning briefly to the Gaza case. Now, Vietnam was mentioned, My Lai, in the last paper, so that's fitting. Now, the extent of US military violence in Vietnam shocked liberal and leftists and is now often forgotten that some of them accused the US of genocide at the time. In his best-selling book, the sociologist Philip Slater discerned what he called a genocidal pattern of of thought in the Vietnam War. Now, student activists and leftist intellectuals, for their part, tended to draw less on outraged liberal morality than on long-standing critiques of capitalist imperialism, often invoking outright parallels between the Holocaust and the American war in Vietnam. And there you can see the badge from the Miami SDS indict the US government for genocide. The next image, as you can see here, comes from a special supplement on US genocide in Vietnam by the Guardian News Weekly, not to be confused with the Manchester Guardian in the UK, which was then the largest leftist news weekly in the US, close to the Communist Party of the US. And then the Cubans got in on the act as well, accusing the US of genocide. Now, beyond these slogans, Beyond these slogans, the main vehicle for the genocide accusation was the unofficial International War Crimes Tribunal that met in 2 sessions in Sweden and Denmark in 1967, organized by the English philosopher Bertrand Russell, hence they're called the Russell Tribunals, and featuring well-known pacifists and leftists like the African-American writer Stokely Carmichael. The Russell Tribunal utilized the continuing prestige of the Nuremberg indictment as a normative standard by which to condemn the US. The tribunal duly invoked the laws of war, listing as its first complaint, aggressive warfare, again, as talked about in the last paper, and the final one was genocide. The publicity surrounding the tribunal fixated on the genocide charge, in part because the French Marxist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, up there, you can make him out behind the haze of smoke maybe, addressed it in his presentation and then published essay on genocide. Now, Sartre made many telling points, I think. He observed that industrial society blurred the combatant, non-combatant distinction. He reasoned actually very much like Jackson without realizing it, except he thinks it's a bad thing, whereas Jackson was like, let's destroy these people. Industrial society, modern warfare blurred the combatant, non-combatant distinction because disabling the enemy's economic capacities necessitated total war, namely attacking its factories and their workers. The same dimension applied in wars of national liberation at this stage of capitalism, when the US replaced conventional occupiers like the French. Whereas the violent repression of, say, the French in Indochina had been limited by the need to retain native labor, the US was not so constrained. It did not seek to exploit the population, but to stop socialist revolutions. Because such revolutions in peasant nations were the product of what Mao called people's wars with their guerrilla tactics, in other words, mobilizing the entire population against the occupier, you were forced to exterminate the entire insurgent people as a neo-imperial imperative. In effect, he concluded, and I quote him, genocide presents itself as the only possible reaction to the insurrection of a whole people against its oppressors. What is more, these are now my words, the American strategy, well, I'm paraphrasing Sartre. The American strategy was intended to warn national liberation movements in Latin America, in particular in the Third World in general, about the consequences of challenging Western-backed regimes. Submit or face extermination was the alternative, as Sartre put it. Now, many commentators agreed that these points were borne out by the evidence that journalists and witnesses had assembled in the late 60s and by the recently released Pentagon papers about the US policy in Vietnam. Now, on this telling, US empire entailed exterminatory violence against civilians until insurgents submitted to US-backed governments. But did genocide capture this logic, like genocide is a legal category? The question, of course, turns on the matter of genocidal intent, exactly as people say in relation to Gaza. Now, Sartre argued, yes, there is genocidal intent because thwarting Vietnamese self-determination was tantamount to national destruction, whether by destroying the socialist project or by enclosing the population in strategic hamlets whose conditions were akin to concentration camps. Moreover, being national in nature, he continued, the killing met the stipulation of the Genocide Convention. The Vietnamese, he said, were attacked simply for being Vietnamese, just as Jews were attacked simply for being Jews. And this is the quote now, it's very misleading by Sartre, not for having been caught carrying a weapon or for having joined a resistance movement, unquote. He tried to obscure, I think, the obvious factual differences between the case. Jews were not engaged in an insurgency against the Germans in the same way that Vietnamese were engaged in a national liberation movement against US occupation or against the southern Vietnamese regime. So it was not difficult for reviewers of this work to point out these differences in the very same way that Israel's defenders point out the differences today. They say the Americans had not escalated the war to total destruction, which they could have, desisting from nuclear weapons and saturation bombing of the North because they were restrained by the prospect of Chinese and Soviet intervention. And neither did Sartre hold the Soviets to the same standard. The Russell Tribunal was completely partisan for the Viet Cong in the North. So by adhering, if you like, to the Holocaust archetype, by trying to sort of map the Holocaust onto Vietnam or the other way around, instead of arguing that genocide was a mode of warfare, Sartre made it easy for his critics to distinguish the cases. And I'm going to give you an example of one of these critics. I think the most philosophically rigorous one. It was the philosopher Hugo Adam Bedau, who in a Boston Journal of Philosophy assessed Sartre's arguments in the following way. Now, these are the quotes. Very important. It's very similar to what we're seeing today. Genocide is not just another crime, not even a war crime, a crime against humanity. For many, it is the ultimate offense. Moreover, accusations of genocide in our time are colored by the paradigm case, still very much within living memory, the treatment of European Jews and other undesirables by the Nazi government until its defeat in 1945. The very term genocide entered our language as the designation of that Holocaust. So as a consequence, he continued, and these are his words as well, there is a strong temptation to assert that injuries that fail to measure up, so what this vertical metaphors, measure up to the fury of the final solution that the Nazis designed for the Jews, do not fit the rubric of genocide. He continued, the inevitable and familiar conclusion was that, quote, Jews were killed not as a means to some further end, but for its own sake. So it's very much like that commentary we read from 1947. It's the same reasoning all the way through. So this is the clincher quote. So while American tactics tended towards genocidal results, he said, the requisite intention was missing. So ergo, not genocide. So you admit genocidal results, but it doesn't look like the Holocaust, so it's not genocide. Now, a hostile critic of Sartre as well was the American-born political scientist at UMass Amherst, Günter Levy. I think he might still be alive, well over 100 by now, right? He published another book saying that another genocide is not genocide. Like he wrote one of the Armenians, not genocide. He wrote one of the Roma, not genocide. Anyway, there's only one genocide for Günter. And he started his career in genocide denial, if you like, in this case. He commenced his reply in this book in the same manner as Bedau. The prototype of genocide, which inspired the convention, was, of course, Hitler's attempted extermination of the Jews of Europe, designed to bring about the final solution of the Jewish question. And there could thus be no question of genocide in Vietnam, because he said the Vietnamese population was increasing. And I've heard that one in relation to Gaza as well. And he basically said, he went through it systematically. The argument didn't stack up, he said. So I would say to strike a partisan blow by equating America with Nazi Germany in its campaign in Vietnam, Sartre made an error and got involved in sort of hair-splitting about genocidal intent that distracted from his otherwise very disturbing points about the mode of the American military campaign. Now, this distraction, of course, was the function of the genocide concept informed by the Holocaust archetype. That did not meet the lofty threshold. Remember, the language is always vertical. Measure up was basically obscured. In proceeding in the conventional manner, Sartre fell into the trap of tying the Holocaust to its genocide to a Holocaust archetype, rather than conceptually stretching the concept or challenging international law, which is what I'm doing. We're trying to sort of convince people war and genocide are not separate things. Genocide is a mode of warfare. Now, the legal defenders of the American war effort cleaved thus very closely to international law because it effectively supported their case about the legitimacy of military necessity. Levy, though not a lawyer, proceeded in a very legalistic fashion with the help of military lawyers in writing that book. And he saw no legal problem with collective punishment because the North Vietnamese strategy explicitly militarized the civilian population, the theory of the People's War from Mao. Very much like Israel advocates talk about Palestinians today as, I didn't insert the slide I wanted to, as being all Hamas supporters, right? Therefore, a legitimate military target. Besides, he continued, the claims about American violence were exaggerated. So these are quotes from the book. The bombing was no worse than in Korea, where it effectively leveled practically all major population centers. Does anyone know? I'm sure Professor here knows how many North Koreans died in the bombings of North Korea in the early 50s. I think 2 million. 2 million. Yeah. There's a professor at the University of Chicago who's written extensively about that. No doubt, he said, some of the shelling was, I love this, lavish. But civilian casualties, he said, were an inevitable part of modern warfare and modern military technology. we hear that again today as well. True, Levy continued, there was much to regret, even if it was not illegal. There was much in the military campaign in Vietnam that was legal, but probably should not have happened, he said. But his case was clear. Civilian casualties were unfortunate, but predictable, though not criminal. Excesses were accidents and could be prosecuted on an ad hoc basis. Levy encapsulated this logic of military necessity down the bottom on the right. While the American way of war undoubtedly took the lives of many non-combatants, these casualties were never inflicted as a matter of policy. So once again, that distinction between an intended killing of a people, which is clearly criminal and genocidal, but if they're killed in the course of a military conflict, even entirely foreseeably, that is simply regrettable. Now, this reasoning has never really left us. Now, I'm going to now finish with a few words on how this all plays out in the debate about the Gaza war. The question is now whether the Genocide Convention addresses the plight of Palestinians in Gaza. Already 6 days after the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, some scholars in genocide studies were writing that Israel was committing genocide or could do so soon. In response, many scholars in Holocaust studies, and I'm guessing quite a few in this conference, thought that this crime was inflammatory and dangerous, and therefore we better not talk about it at all over 4 days in a Genocide Awareness Week. Schumer was, of course, repeating this line of argument. Here are just quotes from, in this case, Norman Goder and Jeffrey Hoek, two very prominent historians of the Holocaust and the Second World War in Nazi Germany, who I've known their work for decades and have written really good work. But this is politics now, right? And so they feel very strongly about it. It's an article in the Washington Post, one of many that they've written over the last couple of years. Now, the view among most historians of the Holocaust is it seems consistent in this respect. This was a war of self-defense, not genocide, and we know that this view continues till the present day. However, much of the world's population, and I'd say even much of the American population, looks aghast upon the West's hypocritical stance to Palestine compared to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, valorizing international law and institutions in the latter while undermining it in the former. For residents of the global south, for example, it's an established fact that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. In an essay published in November 2023, I argued that the anti-war protesters expressed the conceptual but not legal truth of the concept of genocide. That's in the Boston Review. Now, this alignment between law and public perception does not exist yet, okay? In my observation, many activists on the Palestinian side buy into the war versus genocide binary by saying that a genocide and not a war is taking place in Gaza, as you can see in these images. At the same time, though, these very same people celebrate the resistance of Palestinian armed groups there, seemingly not understanding the incoherence of their position. I mean, well, you can't argue that it's not a war, it's a genocide, at the same time say our resistance, our military resistance, which preceded the 7th of October, obviously, in their view, was manifested on the 7th of October, which was an armed attack, is somehow separate from all that. So you can't do it at the same time. At the same time, they've made genocide the center of their advocacy platform, as you can see from this conference program, World Academic Forum for Palestine in April, so exactly 2 years ago. Now, my view is rather than engage in a yes or no calculus that the law of genocide demands, it's a trap, as you can see, the novel nature of the Israeli campaign can call for rethinking of this artificial binary of war or genocide. What we can do is go back now and repair the conceptual flaws in the law of genocide as it was conceived in the mid-1940s, where war and genocide are separated. We can recombine them. Because I think we can, if we look closely at the Israeli conduct of the war, the military and genocidal logics are fused in various ways that international courts could consider in rethinking about how they deduce genocidal intent and the reality of genocide, of group destruction. People are starting to see that military necessity, military targeting, is not separate from genocide, but can be the vehicle for genocidal outcomes and effectively intent. The first aspect is the Israeli military use of AI technology called Lavender that identified 37 males very early on in October and November 23, male targets in Gaza. The human operators spent 20 seconds to verify that they're male, because the assumption was females could not be Hamas members. The settings allowed for 15 or 20 civilian deaths for low-level targets who were killed then with 20,000-pound dumb bombs that flattened buildings with all the occupants inside. Another software is called Where's Daddy, which determined when the target entered the home where the IDF preferred to bomb them, meaning that entire buildings with their mainly women and children inhabitants, so civilians obviously, were killed along with these low-level targets, maybe in a Hamas gas consultant or policeman or something. Leaving aside the cavalier, that is, imprecise manner in which these targets were determined, which was used on cell phone usage, this practice puts pay to the stock defense of the high casualty rate, namely that they were human shields caused by Hamas hiding among the civilians and making them a legitimate military target. In fact, missile operators waited until the targets were among the civilians to launch their ordnance. These are very likely to be war crimes and crimes against humanity, for which a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population is required. And yet the targeting is quite deliberate. The civilian deaths are not incidental, they're calculated. And cumulatively, with the infrastructural destruction, the result clearly is genocidal. Then there is the use of so-called dumb bombs, these 2,000-pound dumb bombs that destroy structures hundreds of meters apart from around their impact. Between the 7th of October and the 17th of November alone, Israel dropped almost 600 of these, a third of them, quote, within dangerous proximity of hospitals across the Gaza Strip, according to a Harvard University report. By their nature, such bombs inflict disproportionate damage, and their cumulative deployment over many months has inflicted untold damage and destruction that cannot be regarded as incidental or collateral. It's calculated and intended in any meaningful sense of the term. Now, here's a map from the Forensic Architecture report on the cartography of genocide, and each of these are a dot that represents a missile or an ordnance of some kind. Now, each of them individually might be a war crime, but you can see there's a cumulative effect. Now, can it be seriously maintained that the people who pulled the trigger on those and those that ordered them high up can't see that there's a pattern here, and that the effect of this is to destroy 80% of a strip of a landmass which is the size of Philadelphia? It's hard to argue seriously that this is incidental or collateral and not in any meaningful sense intended. Now, this messy fusion of military and genocidal logics is also evident in the siege starvation of Gaza. Whereas UN officials and academics had been warning about genocidal famine in Gaza for months last year, Israeli officials and their Western supporters disavowed a genocidal intention by insisting on the military context and tragic byproducts. Now, clearly, the policy is to use starvation as a weapon of war, which is prohibited by the Geneva Conventions, and the requirement that Israel, as the occupying power, that's Articles 55 and 59, supply the population with basic necessities. Now, combined with statements about making Gaza uninhabitable, indeed to destroy it, the effect on the civilian population in no way can be seen as incidental. It's clearly intended in any meaningful sense of the term, and then the effect is genocidal. But the vehicle is military necessity. I don't know if you realize the latitude that the Geneva Conventions allows an occupying power or in an armed conflict to actually engage in siege and starvation for military purposes alone. They use the term military necessity. You are allowed to do that, right? But the limits of that law are clearly identifiable here, because the effect on the civilian population can be genocidal, and the law effectively allows you to put your hands up and say, we didn't mean it, and even though the effect is genocidal. Again, the military and genocidal logics are fused, as they were in Vietnam, or camouflage genocide, as the Dutch called it in 1948. Finally, there is a cynical use of humanitarian rhetoric about safe and sterile zones and passages, ostensibly to remove civilians from combat zones, only to kill them as well as aid workers as they marched off through bombs, a practice that Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur, calls genocide via an interesting humanitarian camouflage. I don't think she read that Dutch report from 1947 or 48, but the language has reappeared. In 2024 and 25, we witnessed talk of concentrating the Palestinians of Gaza in the south, akin to a camp, calling it a humanitarian zone, while plans were openly made for their deportation, which is clearly a crime against humanity. Now, taken together, these ostensibly legal and humanitarian gestures, now including the siege is not illegal. And in some ways, starvation is not illegal. It all depends on the quality of intention. So the Israelis are correct to say that we're operating within humanitarian international law, the laws of armed conflict. But combined with statements from Israeli leaders to depopulate Gaza, along with the destruction of schools, universities, mosques, hospitals, agricultural land, as well as buildings in general, the rubble of which could take up to 2040 to remove, including the gratuitous destruction of medical equipment and reported sniper killing of Palestinian children, it's possible to avoid the conclusion that not only the effect, but the point of the military action, which is on the face of it not illegal, is not solely to defeat Hamas, as claimed by Israeli lawyers and leaders in their more cautious moments, but to destroy the possibility of Palestinian life in Gaza. And yet, the ICJ ruled in the Bosnia-Serbia case in 2007 that much of that kind of destruction in the course of an armed conflict does not evince a genocidal intention. The jurisprudence, let us not forget, is extraordinarily conservative and restrictive. It allows states to do all kinds of terrible things and say it's not genocide. And that, of course, is the way the international legal architecture was established after the Second World War, as I showed. So the question, I'm ending with this, the question will be how the court analogizes between the Serbian conduct in Bosnia, and then in the next case it hears, which is a Myanmar case with its obvious murder, with its murderous expulsion of the Rohingya in 2017, and then next with the Israeli campaign in Gaza. I mean, I'm actually quite pessimistic. I think if they stick to their very restrictive jurisprudence, they'll say it's not genocide. Now, international lawyers are beginning to understand that military and genocidal logics are not one or the other, but can run together or accompanied, as that report said, you remember? But we are in uncharted legal territory, even if European, global, and American publics can see what's going on, which is the destruction of a people. The distinctive modalities of the Israeli campaign, I think, can afford the ICJ judges an opportunity to clarify this this domain of international law. So the world awaits their determination with great anticipation. Thank you.
So thank you for your talk, Dirk. That gives us a lot to think about. This is my fourth, I believe, time coming here. And I've really appreciated the opportunities to have constructive dialogue about issues that can be very contentious, and the opportunity to talk about Gaza is partly what informed your invitation. So we appreciate your being here. I would, at this point, like to focus on the people in the room and anyone online who might have questions. We have probably a little over 20 minutes to have some dialogue.
So thank you so much for being here and giving us that amazing presentation. My question is around the terminology, because it seems like there's a huge like void, or maybe invasion, or like you said earlier, denial. I'm not sure if you said it was, but it seems like there's these terms that are constantly morphing and transforming and giving invasion and illusion to what is really occurring, obviously, with people and humanitarian efforts as a face. How can we, especially as like new age is coming into this, how can we maneuver through such weeds of the terminology?
Great question. I'm really glad you asked it because it allows me to comment now on this image. Okay, could you put that one back up? Thank you. Do you all know who Hind Rajab was? Okay, so I think this image and the text with it gives you a sense of the problems of genocide. Now, what the designer of that meme is trying to do is analogize between Hind Rajab and Anna Frank. because the usual terminology is picture of Anna Frank or, say, a Jewish child in the Holocaust. Their only crime was being Jewish. They were killed just for being Jewish, for who they are, not for anything they've done. Okay? So that is what we would call in the criminological literature an image of the exemplary victim. The exemplary victim is a victim that is agentless and innocent, has not done anything to deserve the treatment that they've received or suffered. So it's almost a sacrificial logic. They're exemplary because they've been killed for no other reason than an identity. It's an identity crime. Whereas other kinds of victims are somehow caught up, say, in an armed conflict and are killed collaterally, incidentally. Once again, that distinction between war and genocide. And that's the rules of the memory game worldwide. Okay, so Armenians, for example, say Armenians were killed solely because they're Armenians. Turks say no, there was a Armenian insurgency, or there was an Armenian national project which was going to dismember. They put it into political context, right? And then they're kind of talking past each other. I would argue that this is a trap for Palestinians because Hind Rajab was not killed solely for being Palestinian. She was caught in a firefight as her car and I think an ambulance were passing through. At the same time, so the circumstances are very different for Anna Frank, who was hiding, this totally innocent girl hiding in an attic in Amsterdam, a refugee from Frankfurt. Okay, and it wasn't involved. She wasn't in the middle of the firefight, an armed conflict. At the same time, could anyone deny that the killing of Hind Rajab was a shocking crime? How many bullets from that tank were fired into that car? Over 350. I mean, her body was torn to bits. And of course, everyone else, her entire family was killed. Has anyone listened to the phone call that she made? It's on YouTube. Have you listened to it? Have you listened to it? It's worse than the film. Like, it's unbearable. Okay. It's a distinctive kind of evil. It doesn't need to be assimilated to the Holocaust. It's its own thing. Now, the trap is also evident in these images, where rather than paint Hind as a helpless child, they're now turning Anna Frank into an insurgent Palestinian, so political agency, by putting her with a keffiyeh. Okay, of course, Anna Frank with her dark eyes and dark hair could easily be Palestinian in looking. Now, the complaint, of course, from the European Jewish Congress that this is a misrepresentation of who Anna Frank was, and indeed anti-Semitic. But you'll see the point I'm making is not to say this is right or wrong or offensive. It's like the rules of the memory game trap Palestinians and anyone involved in a national liberation movement, mind you, into using the iconography of the Holocaust to their own ends. But I think it distorts, in this sense, Anna Frank, but it also distorts their own cause. But that's the power of the Holocaust archetype, which has also infused this conference and led to the repression of the question of Gaza here. Okay, I'm sure my paper here is in a sense an accident. Now, the reason I put this image on the cover of my book, The Problems of Genocide, is to uncover this problem. I didn't put a picture of a Holocaust survivor like Anna Frank on the cover of a million books. I put an image here of a Yemeni family by a Yemeni street artist called Murad Subeh. You can see his website there. I paid him, of course, to use his image. He's a street artist. He paints on ruins in the Banksy style, like not in art galleries. He goes to the ruins of the war in Yemen. He's now in exile in France because he's persona non grata for the government there. And in this case, he printed or painted on the back wall of the building in which that family was killed by a Saudi ordinance in 2015. And it's called Family Portrait. And you can see it's slightly a kilter because it indicates that there was a bomb there. There's a raven there to indicate their death. And he's trying to bring them into memory. Now, I ask you, why? They're not victims of genocide and classically defined. They are classic, if you like, victims of an armed conflict, peripheral. But they have no status, no purchase in our memory culture because they don't look like Anna Frank. That's why Palestinians resort to this her only crime was being Palestinian. And that's, of course, how Palestinians will experience it. But I think it's a distortion. And it's because we've got this artificial distinction between war and genocide, where victims of genocide are victims that we should commemorate. Victims of war, who gives a shit, according to our memory culture, right? People like these are completely forgotten, right? That is one of the problems of genocide. So my answer to your question about is not to engage in is a genocide or a war, engaging in this tug of war. It's a genocidal war. They're both. So I think we need to mainstream that insight. In other words, remember Lemkin said genocide's a war of extermination. It's where you're no longer waging war against armed military personnel, you're attacking the entire population. That's a war of extermination. And has that been going on against Ukrainians? And it's a less intensive, it's a much bigger country, there's 40 million people, but the Russians are systematically destroying civilian infrastructure there in a sort of a wearing them down with the death of 1,000 cuts. The situation in Gaza, obviously, very different because it's tiny, it's the size of a city, you've got only 2 million people there, but and no one can escape, whereas a lot of Ukrainians have left. But the attack on the civilian population is also impossible to miss. And that's why people are talking about genocide. Okay.
Can I real quick, the numbers, does the numbers matter whether or not it's, it's only genocide if it's a massive casualty versus war?
There's a debate among the international lawyers. Like, in the Genocide Convention, you've got the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. There are libraries of books and jurisprudence on each of those subphrases. What does intent mean? What does destroy mean? What does an ethnic, racial, or religious group mean? What does in whole or in part mean? What does as such mean? The in whole or in part has itself generated a literature, and the consensus is a substantial part. But it's all as relational and contextual. Quote unquote, only 8,000 men and boys were murdered in Srebrenica. 8,000. Far more in Palestine, right? It's now vastly more than 70,000, right? And yet in Srebrenica, there's a genocide according to the ICTY, that people are quibbling about it. So it's really not about absolute numbers. It's about, for the law, the quality of the intention, not the outcome. But of course, that's one of the problems. So it takes me a while because I teach genocide, of course, and I actually don't teach my book. I don't believe in setting your own work. You introduce the students to the literature, but you do problematize the concept. The problem is that most people, among many problems, think that genocide is a real thing, like that the law of genocide is somehow pure and the mirrors a reality. It's a gross distortion of the reality of armed conflict and the context in which civilians are killed in masses. How many people realize when they study Rwanda, there was actually a war going on between the Rwandan government and the RPF? And I think it was a genocidal attack, obviously, but it was in the context of a much larger armed conflict in which, lots of Hutus were killed by RPF as well. And I think a full account of civilian casualties would require that zooming out to see that kind of thing. But we need to ask ourselves as well, why is there a fetish of the genocide concept? Why do victim groups want genocide and are unhappy with settling just for crimes against humanity and war crimes? We need to have that conversation as well.
And I think we have at least 3 questions that we haven't gone online yet. Okay, and just in the interest, because we have about maybe 15 or so minutes, so in the interest of kind of helping you calibrate your response and trying to get questions.
I tend to get long and elaborate.
Okay.
Yeah, we're finally talking about the elephant in a room, right? That was here for 4 days. So I have not heard a word about Hamas. Can you tell us more?
The Hamas.
Huh?
The Hamas.
No, it's the Hamas. Hamas. Hamas is an organization, and Hamas is, as you did not tell the audience, in case people don't know, how well Hamas is embedded, not only in population center, that's of course, but in the ground, 500 miles of underground of Hamas. Let's do an experiment here, a thought experiment. You are a even a soldier, don't have to be high up on the hierarchy. How would you react after October 7th? If you were near Oz or in Holit or in all the other places, I don't know to what extent you know the geography of Israel in the Otef Gaza, what would you do? Let me just make the situation a little bit crisper. People experience it as Shoah. That's the word that was used after October 7th, including my own family, by the way, Miros. So tell us, what would you do? How would you, with all your commitment to the values that I definitely agree with, deal with Hamas?
Why don't you tell me, what would you do? What have you been arguing?
I've been arguing that the story that you're telling is not sufficiently full. That a lot of people really don't know what it means to struggle for existence. This is an existential war for Israel. So I'm not justifying my position is probably closer to Olmert, but more or less. So the problem is that the debate has not been appropriate because it doesn't tell the full story, the complexity of the situation. And at the same time, the war is happening when they have a good number of people, 200 people as hostages, and they have to do something about that. How do you do it? How do you dislodge this incredible military organization?
I guess they decided to destroy Gaza.
They probably did. And there probably is closer to war crime. If you need the definition, I'm definitely not a lawyer and I cannot do it. But I think that the complexity of what Israel has been facing since October 7th is not brought to the fore. Therefore, it's enough for go to the imagery of Anne Frank. Yeah, so this is where the imagery is now shifting how the world sees Jews, how the world sees Israelis. They all become pariah. They all become basically is anti-Semitism in another name or under another garb. That's a good use. It's another garb. So that's why the situation has become so complicated. And that's why people who are in Holocaust studies don't like to talk to people in genocide studies. That's why academia is so fragmented right now.
We're doing a good job here, I think, aren't we?
Yeah, we are doing a good job because we are committed to that.
Yeah.
We are committed and we've built it for 5 years. This is the 5th year. But most people don't do this kind of conversations. So all I'm telling you that as you go as a scholar of this material, do give a fuller picture of what's happening on the ground in Gaza on a military.
I'll go back to the beginning and remind you of this scholar here, whose material I read right back at the beginning. There he is, John Spencer. He argues this line all the time. It's quite familiar to me, what you're saying. What you're saying is quite familiar to me. The argument is that Israel had no alternative in the context of dense urban warfare, where the Hamas had lodged itself carefully in the population and then had all these tunnels. Israel had no alternative but to flatten Gaza. That's the argument. And I don't really want to get into that now, but I don't think anyone takes it very seriously.
I don't know what. I'm telling you that it's a real. Israel is now fighting for its existence.
Really?
Yes, very much.
Against Hamas? Really? Hamas was defeated in a couple of rooms.
They haven't succeeded so far.
Yeah.
But does Israel have a right? Israel is an
Yeah.
illegal occupying power in Gaza. Doesn't have a right to destroy Gaza.
This is a very important conversation, but just in the
I
interest
think
of
you're
getting
right.
to some other questions.
You don't understand the legalities of
we
the
need to wrap
situation.
up.
Yeah.
So to take it to, I don't, maybe you did touch on it slightly, but generally what we're talking about is either a case where it's in interest of time. Basically, we've talked about, a case where it's either a case of genocide or a genocidal war, but in either case, in the case of Nazi Germany, for instance, they were invading other countries, but they were also persecuting their own citizens. I'm wondering how, basically this all plays into something like the dirty war in Argentina, where you have a government waging a war against its own population. It's not invading any other country. It's not dealing with any sort of territorial power or insurgency. It was literally waging a war on its own citizens for their beliefs.
Yeah. So what's the question? I'm not sure I understand it.
I guess my question would be this whole idea where, you know, a war is either genocide,
Yeah.
or I mean, where it's either genocide or it's a war that leads to genocidal consequences. But what happens when it's essentially, you know, a genocide or a democide, but like, you know, it's a mass killing of people within a country. It doesn't invade any other countries. Like, I feel like there's been a lot of not ignorance, but a lot of silence around that because it's no less a genocide just because no borders were crossed.
Are you suggesting the Argentinian dirty war is a genocidal war against its own population?
I mean, I think that there were definitely elements of that, including the fact that there was a lot of Nazi ideology that was used, and the Jewish population of Argentina was disproportionately targeted.
The sociologist Daniel Firestein has written quite a lot about those very cases. I'm not sure if you're aware. Afterwards I can give you the references, but he's been making that case in various Latin American contexts, and you know, it's very powerful work. But it doesn't, you know, it's not front page news in the US or anywhere, but in Latin America, very important.
Yeah, and I believe we have two, thank you for your question. And I believe we have two questions left. Are we taking any from online? There's no, okay. All right, so I believe we have two more questions. Thank you.
Dirk, thanks so much for your careful exploration of this conflict between genocide and genocidal warfare. Any of us, I think, who teach on the convention, you know, it's interesting to get students grappling with the problems of the convention, and you've done a wonderful job of teasing out that part of it. I do want to also say I appreciate how his concerns, and I certainly hear same from many of my Jewish friends. What I'm curious to ask you about, Dirk, is what you were just starting to nudge into, which is when you started to talk about atrocity, the language of atrocity, crimes against humanity, war crimes, which in international law carry same consequences. So can you talk a little bit about what you're trying to change the understanding of, and the definition of genocide, really? What about the other alternative, which is to abandon the word, even though it's very hard to do because people want to use it, but it's so problematic? And what about the alternative of just abandoning it and settling for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so on, atrocity?
So I'm glad you asked that question. In my book, actually, which is, you know, already 5 or 6 years old now, make a case for the abandonment. But, you know, various colleagues and Jewish and Palestinian have not been happy about that because they regard the concept as an asset for them. I mean, this chap here, Feinberg says, you know, it's a concept created to prevent Jewish annihilation, not annihilation of groups in general. And you can't use it against us. So it's an asset for, as he sees it, an asset for the Jews. I've had Palestinian friends and colleagues say equally, well, now that we've got this ICJ case, thanks to South Africa, it's an asset for us. And you're not helping, Dirk, by complicating it and saying that it's an incoherent concept. So in a recent article responding to Martin Shaw in the Journal of Perpetrator Research, where he critiques my book, I respond by saying, well, look, the reality is it's an international convention. It's embedded in the ICC statute and in domestic laws in many countries. I mean, there's no unscrewing the screw. It's part of our vocabulary, our moral vocabulary, and our laws. So you can't undo that. But what you can try to do is repoliticize this depoliticized concept. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at that quote about Anna Frank or Hind Rajam being killed just for being Palestinian, I think we need to get away from that language of someone is murdered solely for their identity, for who they are and not for what they've done. The reality of state violence is that much of it is driven by paranoid, therefore unhinged, appreciations or appraisals of security threats. And people are attacked preemptively. And that's why I've heard so many Israeli politicians saying you've got to kill the Palestinian children because they will grow up to be terrorists. Like barely a week goes by when politician, media personality, I mean, I don't read or listen to Hebrew, but it's in translation. And my Israeli friends send this to me. It's like an influx. Because I've written about the destruction of children as a classic act of permanent security, as I call it, because there's an anticipatory logic. You don't kill just an immediate security threat, which is a banal thing, right? You anticipate future security threats. That is the logic we saw on the American and the Australian frontiers, because I've written a lot on colonial genocide. As you recall, my first book was on Australia. Nits make lice. You all know what nits are, right? Baby lice. Those that when I had hair back in the day, when I was at primary school in the 70s in Australia, here I'm dating myself now. Some of you, I don't know if you had that problem in America, but if one kid at school, one kid came to school with lice, we all had to get kerosene in our hair, I think, and a very fine tooth comb to pull out the nits, right? Because these are the eggs. So the logic was on the American frontier and in Australia, you've got to kill the baby indigenous people because they'll grow up to become warriors or mothers of warriors, and who will be insurgents, in other words. You've got to kill the insurgency in the bud, nip it in the bud is another. So that was the logic, unfortunately, which was applied to Anna Frank and all Jewish children. It's like they're obviously not a security threat now, but the Nazis were thinking generationally. Like they are, the Jews for them are an enemy people, and we have to kill them all, and even the children, because they'll grow up to become an enemy. And that is what, that logic is being used against Palestinian children. I'm not, that's a very subversive thing to say, but that's what Moshe Zimmerman said recently in a talk in Australia, in the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt in December. Moshe Zimmerman, the prominent historian of Germany at the Hebrew University, who I know, he was my host when I was a research fellow at the Hebrew University in 2007. You might be surprised to know. I taught at Haifa University once in 2013, to the horror of my Palestinian friends. It was a BS. But I wanted to see what it's like to work and live in Israel and talk to people and travel around down to Sderot. Is that what it's called? Sderot. I went down there with a militarized bus, with thick panels in case a missile came in, into one of the bunkers and so forth. In any event, so the question was about
Just the language that war crime.
yes. So I think we're stuck with genocide, but we need to get the judges at the ICJ to understand that military and genocide logic can commingle. Once they do that, then people can understand that warfare can be genocidal. It's not one or the other. But it will take decades. I mean, it takes decades, if not longer, to shift a discourse. Like genocide very quickly became embedded as in global, not just Western, vocabulary of evil by the 50s and 60s. People were quickly analogizing with the Holocaust. And of course, that is accompanied or a function of the rise of Holocaust memory. As the Holocaust becomes the symbol of evil, then of course, and some people call it the A-grade currency, what's the global currency of suffering, then naturally other groups want to affiliate with that. And you can't have one or the other. Unfortunately, you get liberals like Marco Ignatieff are constantly kvetching that people are sullying, besmirching the sacral, pure nature of genocide by affiliating, by saying there's a Holocaust, abortion Holocaust, a Nanking Holocaust, everything suddenly Holocaust or a genocide. But my view as analyzing this is rather than be normative and moralistic about you can't do that. I'm not into lecturing victim groups about how they deploy their language. I'm curious as an analyst, well, why do they feel compelled to do that? Well, of course, once you have the gold standard of suffering, everyone wants to participate in it, right? And then you have all these analogical battles. Does it look like the Holocaust or does it look like it doesn't look like? So here is an attempt to affiliate Hind Rajab with Anna Frank, if you like. And as I said before, why can't we be supple enough to understand the distinctive evil in both cases without ranking them? Well, without question, what happened to Hind Rajab, who stands in for tens of thousands of Palestinian little boys and girls, right? Why can't that be seen as a distinctive evil, which also applies to the children in Yemen, right? In Yemen. Now, the one reason I put a Yemenese family on the cover of my book, who could easily be a family in Gaza, as a mother in a hijab, right? If I put a Palestinian family there, I wouldn't be standing before you now. No university would hire me. I would have been run out of academia. And you know that. Now, why is that? I put it to you. Why is that?
Well, we
Okay.
got it might be
So another friend and
appropriate
colleague.
for,
has a question.
for Henry to ask a
Uh,
question.
Okay,
Final
so
question.
first of all, Dirk, thank you for your presentation, your book, and so forth. I think one of the things that it's done as you intended was to raise some questions that need to be addressed if we're going to deal with mass violence going forward. So thank you very much for that. And I appreciate the very important point about this idea of separating war from genocide as a very even tactical move with clear reasons behind it that undermine the very principles of human rights that were supposed to generate all of the things that the Genocide Convention was supposed to address. So thank you for that. I do want to answer your question about Israel by going back to the U.S. response to September 11th. The U.S. responded to a criminal act with an all-out military response. Those are two different things. Terrorism is a criminal act. And what we see again and again and again in the last few decades is a response to individual, I won't say individual, but criminal acts that can be handled through a criminal justice or an international criminal law and so forth process, responded to with a kind of indiscriminate war, which undermines the legitimacy of that criminal justice response. And that would be my answer is treat criminal acts through the appropriate means. I want to ask, in going through some of the stuff you've done, it reminded me of the Aceh issue in Paraguay and Ben Whitaker's report in 1985, where again the Paraguayan government said that, oh, we're not committing genocide because we're trying to get land.
Yeah.
And I think you're getting into that same issue of this rationalization. The question I would ask, however,
Camouflage.
what's that?
Camouflage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the question I would ask is the issue that the concept of genocide or war or whatever is not adequate for the ways we're using it, or that no matter what we use, we're going to face manipulation and denial? And I think you were suggesting that. That is, if we get rid of the term genocide and rightfully, in my opinion, say that war is fundamentally wrong, wrong in all, except for basic self-defense, right? Well, however we qualify it, the U.S. has been doing this for decades. Oh, we call it a police action. We call it, this or that. Are we going to end up again in the same situation? Because no matter what, people will manipulate whatever language we're using in the way that they want to.
Yeah. So the question is, remind me, just the takeaway question is,
are we dealing with denial or a problem in the concept of genocide?
right. Okay. So maybe both.
Okay.
I mean, I do think the law of genocide is, as it's codified, is conceptually incoherent by design, as you saw, to be able to allow states to engage in genocidal warfare. I mean, let's not forget some examples. The Biafra-Nigeria war in the late 1960s accounted for maybe 3 million people, mainly through starvation. Right? Now, when I mention that to friends who are exercised about cases today, they had no idea. I mean, the numbers are staggering and far greater than any armed conflicts today. Right? Only a year later, you had the secession of East Pakistan from Pakistan to establish the state of Bangladesh. Now, the Bangladeshi authorities talk about 3 million there too, but it's more likely 1 million. But that's a lot of people as well. And in both cases, the victim groups launched an international campaign for genocide recognition, very much like the campaigns we see today by Ukrainians for Ukraine and by Palestinians and their supporters It's in the newspapers. Their students are marching, there's sit-ins and so forth. And I give a separate paper on that with lots of PowerPoints with images of these, like Bangladeshis and Bengalis marching through London. There's a large population there. End the genocide, stop the British support for the genocide for Pakistan and so forth. And you had questions in Parliament where the opposition say this is the greatest crime since the Second World War. The Pakistanis are killing Bangladeshi solely because they're Bangladeshi, and the Igbo as well are doing the same in regard to their secessionist entity, Biafra, in Nigeria. And in all cases, they try to analogize with the Holocaust. And in fact, the Igbo said, we are the Jews of Africa, and which was convenient for them because the Hausa, mainly the other groups they were engaged with, were Muslims in the north. They were a heavily Christianized group. There were Irish missionaries there, and so there were lots of connections between Biafra and the West. But Western governments were, on the whole, pro federal military government, and it was diplomatically very messy. But the genocide advocacy campaign was very emphatic and had large purchase on American campuses. It split the African American community, incidentally, because Nigeria was the largest new African state, founded in 1960, and no one really wanted to see it fail. On the other hand, a lot of Africans were dying. So in all cases, there was an attempt in making the genocide case to analogize with the Holocaust. Now, of course, these cases look very different to the Holocaust, right? And they then thus failed. And it's in studying these advocacy campaigns that I realized that there was, this is the late 60s and early 70s, that there was no jurisprudence on genocide then. You didn't have any ICJ cases. There were no ICTYs and ICTRs and so forth. It was really just public advocacy. I mean, there was a UN report investigation committee in the Nigeria case, and they said no genocide to see here. And you could see that in the media that all these analogies ultimately failed. And in fact, a prominent genocide historian who was a graduate student, interestingly, is it Robert Melson?
Yeah, Bob Nelson.
Bob Melson. Exactly. And then he wrote later on Armenia, on revolution and genocide. Yeah. But I followed his writings on that because he was, I think he's from a child survivor family.
He is a child survivor.
So he's very honest in his own identifications. He said, I really identified with the Biafrans. They were like me, like African children, Biafran children hiding like I hid. So, they were for him in this sort of melodrama, the Jews. It was the Holocaust was being replayed. But when the war ended in January 1970 and the victorious military government stopped and the killing stopped, he said, oh, this isn't like the Nazis, because the Nazis would have kept killing. So ergo, it's not a genocide. End of story. And there was a foundational moment in because these were the founders of genocide studies. They were young people at the time. So I need to wrap up, I'm being told. But anyway, it's all in my book, all these details, right, if you want to go. So clearly there's always going to be vexatious and other kinds of advocacy. But I think the genocide concept needs to be rethought. We're stuck with it, but it needs to be repoliticized. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. I'll ask you later. We're talking about Roberta Martin Shaw's
Okay.
Talking about degenerative warfare.
Yeah.
Well, that concludes our conference. I'm going to keep my closing remarks very brief. It's been a long week. I think people are exhausted. Want to thank everybody who attended, both online, in the room, our organizers, students, especially for coming out. Of course, all our panelists, speakers, presenters, Jewish Studies for hosting this event, our staff, all the people I named at the beginning of the conference, from our shipper staff to our Jewish Studies staff. I'm going to pass over all the things that we covered, but we did do some really cool stuff. I think we, especially our inaugural student scholar exchange, where we could, talk about education, state of the field, where it's going. We had another highly successful student panel, and it's always nice to have the NAU people in the room, which I think really kind of fed the energy with that. And of course, it'd be remiss if we did not, thank our sponsors, of course, Rosenbluth Family Charitable Foundation, who's now funded this for 5 years. The Arizona Community Foundation, SAFO Center, the Assyrian Student Association of Arizona, Assyrian American Cultural Organization, Fresno State Armenian Studies Program, the Mesa East Valley MLK Committee, NAU, who's showing up with faculty, students, a lot of support, Phoenix Holocaust Association, St. Apgar Armenian Apostolic Church, they showed up well today, Scottsdale Community College, who will be hosting an event tomorrow night, and of course, the Zorian Institute, who co-sponsored that scholar-student symposium and brought in a lot of speakers, and happy to have you here, Amy, and happy to have met your father as well here. And we've had incredible, our ASU people, I've mentioned Jewish Studies, the School of Social Transformation, the Humanities Institute. We had a really nice lunch yesterday with Antoinette Colley's Blackbird Fly art exhibition. That's going to be on exhibit until May 22nd, so you still got time to see it. If I'm on campus, I'm happy to show people the exhibition because got the scan card to get in there in case the door is locked. And we've had incredible, again, administrative support here from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, namely Dean Jeffrey Cohen, Richard Amesbury, who is here this evening, the Director of Shippers, Stanley Mervis, who's done a lot of work for this conference, and we wouldn't have got it done without you. The Director of Jewish Studies, and of course our board, Alex Alvarez, who's not here, Bjorn Korendorfer, Chris Holman, Lisa Marcio from SEC. Again, another shout out to Stanley Mervis, Ambassador Edward O'Donnell, who brought in David Michael Crane, and of course, Hava T. Roche Samuelson. And again, Lisa, Kay, Gloria, our Jewish Studies staff, Becky Sang, Julia Taylor, Kalani, Yvonne, they do all the work around here and make all our events happen, and they feed us at these events. They, do the logistics, get people here, get people paid, reach out to people and do all like the bureaucratic stuff, which is exhausting and takes a lot of work. And, it's often unrecognized work behind the scenes. And of course, Ari. What would we do without you? Especially when you have other less technically inclined people muddling around your stuff there. Sure that causes some anxiety. So just want to thank everyone who's attended and supported this conference and who continues to support it. Thank you.